Well, today we're going to be talking about aesthetics and specifically about spirituality. Now, we did touch on the topic of secular spirituality a little bit in our discussion on the nature of people, but we're going to be sort of expanding that topic in a little bit more depth today. And the reason is that when we talk about aesthetics, aesthetics is the philosophy of beauty. It's sort of rational analysis of that which doesn't really submit itself to rational analysis. You know, it'd be like the philosophy of anger, or the philosophy of love. You can have a science of those phenomena to see what effects it has on the body and how it's expressed and what causes it and genetic predispositions and so on. But beauty is one of those categories of human experience that, as they say, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? It's a subjective phenomenon. So trying to come up with canonical categories for that is like doing that with tastes, you know? You like spicy food, you don't like spicy food, is that good or bad for humanity? Well, I know people that have opinions on that, but I don't particularly give them a lot of credence because it's a personal choice. So on some level, aesthetics is a personal category, but as a human phenomenon, it is worth exploring, particularly as it comes to this concept we call spirituality. It's a very basic human need because every culture has had some way of meeting this human need for whatever we mean by spirituality, which we'll be talking about. But we also find that some secular people are uncomfortable with the concept of spirituality. I mentioned the anecdote in our previous discussion of this, that if you ask people, do you like the word spirituality or not, you'll get a split opinion. Some like it, some don't. But if you ask people, have you had what might be considered a spiritual experience, they'll come up with things like an experience in nature or a beautiful symphony or the birth of a child or a grandchild. They'll have moments that are those getting beyond themselves, feeling self-dissolving, feeling connected to a wider world or their own family heritage. They have those experiences that you might call spiritual, even if they wouldn't call it spiritual themselves. So it's really a question of vocabulary as much as anything else. So I'll tell one anecdote of a spiritual experience that I had, and maybe you'll recognize something of this in your own experiences. When I was in graduate school, I was living a very busy life. I was commuting to and from Ann Arbor, getting my master's degree. I was also taking rabbinic classes at the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism with Sherwin Wine. I was teaching Sunday school and Hebrew school weekday afternoons. And then on top of all that going on, my father became sick. And my father was someone who barely went to the doctor, let alone got sick. He was always in great health and worked out several times a week. And here he was sick and actually in the hospital. And it had to be really serious for him to consent to go to the hospital. It turned out he had a case of what was called diverticulitis, which is an inflammation of the intestines caused by seeds or other things getting stuck in the corners and whatever. Anyways, at the time we didn't know exactly what it was. He was just having a lot of pain and he looked like he should be in the hospital. So I was adding to my routine having to drive out to Beaumont Hospital, which is further west than even the house I was living in. I was doing that when I had time in between other things. And one day, it was one of those stressful weeks where I had a lot going on. I'm driving west and I come over a hill, and right in front of me, I see the thickest rainbow I had ever seen. I mean, it was like, I don't know, if a regular rainbow was at width 2 or 3, this was like 10. It was 3 or 4 times as wide as any rainbow I'd ever seen. And I had a moment of just saying, wow, that is absolutely beautiful. Now, I didn't have the conceit to imagine that the universe had conspired to show me that rainbow just for me because I needed it in that moment. But I also appreciated the fact that this was a moment of beauty that if I had not been paying attention or I'd been so focused on everything else going on, I would have missed it. And so I realized that this was the kind of moment that we find valuable to cultivate and that we might refer to as a spiritual moment because it comes in the unexpected and it sticks with us. And it provided something we needed at the moment that it happened. Now, about 2,000 years ago, a rabbi once said, if a person is walking on his way and is studying rabbinic law, and he interrupts his study of the law and says, how beautiful is this tree and how pleasant is this newly plowed field? It is as if he has sinned against his own soul. You see, in that theology, nature is not an acceptable source of meaning. the religious tradition, the authority is where you go to have that meaningful experience, but also what's most important in your life. So if you're studying the law, don't get distracted by beautiful nature. Now, I, as a very different kind of rabbi, would say, if someone is walking on their way and they say, how pleasant is this tree, or how beautiful is this field, and then they interrupt that contemplation to consider how much more profitable it would be to build a strip mall on top of them, that is as if you have sinned against your own soul. So for me, the primary focus can be appreciating the tree or the field. That can be the meaningful moment, the study of the universe, the connection to what is most important. So what do we mean by spiritual experience? Well, we're talking about what we call a natural spirituality or a secular spirituality. Think about if you're watching the Discovery Channel and you see a program about primates and primate behavior, and you recognize what you think of as human behavior, and then you realize, oh, that's right, it's primate behavior, the grooming and the social hierarchies and the caring for the young and the play and everything else. Or maybe you look at an old family photograph that goes back 80, 100, 150 years even, and you recognize the ears or the nose. We have pictures of my father's mother's family back when she was a teenager still living in Aleppo, Syria. But I look at the pictures, the faces of the men standing in the back behind the women sitting in the front, and they look like my dad. They look like my uncle. I mean, they are part of that same genetic bucket. and this picture was taken in the 1910s. And so I get a sense of transcendence from that. And I mentioned last time we talked about this as well, my experience going to the Western Wall and feeling how smooth the wall was and realizing it was from generations of my people touching those stones. So I'm curious for those who are here, either in class or online, what would be an example of a natural spirituality moment that you had that you'd be willing to share that stuck with you, if anyone has one?
Given my own definition of spirituality, which actually I was just writing some stuff down here, I think it would be, so it fits with that. I mean, I am also not a theist. I don't believe that it requires any external being of any type to be able to have a spiritual experience. In fact, I'm in the middle of writing a paper called Spirituality Without Spirits.
Yeah, good.
So I would say, you know, if you have a sense of awe and wonder, if you have a felt sense of the divine, not to be.
Have you had a discrete experience? Yeah, I'm interested in hearing like examples of discrete experiences.
I think playing music would be an example, because these things that happen, there's a loss of a sense of time,
right?
A transcendence of ego, a loss of self-object distinction. Mm-hmm. Those are all different characteristics in my definition of spiritual experience. Sure. And you don't need spirits to do it.
Some might call it when you're in the athletic flow. You know, you're just.
Yes.
I've had that playing squash when I was good at it in college. There'd be some points where I didn't even know how I did what I did, but it was just in the perfect flow, and I knew exactly what was happening next, and I hit it exactly where I wanted it, and that was that sense of just being swept away by the moment. Anyone else have?
We have something to explain that. It's called the inner self, you know, for sports, but when you're in the zone, you know, but that's a whole nother conversation. Kathy said, you know, one thing was when we approached the north rim of the Grand Canyon, and for the first time you see this immensity, you know, and you hear it, you hear the rush of the wind. For me, the first time I went to the Grand Canyon was before I was married, and I arrived in the evening, and the moon was out, but at the same time there were thunderstorms in the canyon, and you could see flashes of lightning in the clouds, and the clouds are very low into the canyon. It was kind of like this amazing experience of hearing. But I think most of the sorts of things that we've experienced have been natural wonder, you know, standing there. But there are times, okay, so this is weird, but I did a living history at Gettysburg a few times. And one time we were camped at the Pennsylvania Monument, which is right a few steps from the first Minnesota monument, and these guys made this amazing charge and it suffered 83% casualties against one of the brigades of the Confederates, and drove them back momentarily just in time. And in the middle of the night, I got up and I sort of stood by this monument, and it was sort of spooky, I mean, just sitting there knowing that thousands of men had struggled in this spot at that moment, 100 and however many years it was at that point, and being on that very ground at that time. And I've had that several times with historical sites like that. So that's
Wonderful.
my experience. Yeah.
Alan?
Are we talking about nature type of spirituality, or just anything,
Anything, doesn't have to only be nature.
Okay. I don't even know if this really applies, but this is the first thing that popped up into my mind. Many, many years ago, probably 40 years ago or so, or maybe not that long, 30 years ago, I went on, I grew up with a dog, huge 125-pound German Shepherd. And he was toward the end of his life when I left for this vacation. When I came back, my parents had to put him to sleep. So that night, and the dog always had a habit that right after I got into bed, I closed the lights, he would come into my room and jump on my bed. So anyway, so that night I had my bedroom door open, just went into the bed, and all of a sudden I felt his presence coming alongside my bed and jumping in my bed with me. And I'm thinking, I'm not asleep. And I just can't explain this feeling. I felt it was him, but it was just a very weird, supernatural type of experience. So I don't know if that really qualifies for what we're discussing or not.
Well, I mean, it's not what we would call a natural spirituality experience, right, because it's more focused on this world. And it might also be, an example of, your mind and your body gets into this mental habit of expecting this experience to happen, and then you feel it. There are people who have lost a loved one, sometimes very suddenly, and they feel their presence in the bed and roll over, and they're not there anymore, of course, but it's just the mental and physical habit that they've gotten into with having that presence there. Now, I mean, I don't have any, magical dog ghost detectors that I could set up to see if there really was something there or not. But it is one of those examples of, whether it's wish fulfillment or whether there was something there. Again, we can't determine at this distance, but it's one of those cases where we understand that there's that emotional need there. There was a gap for you, and something filled it.
Either way, it seems like it was. Even though I would argue that it's something that occurs between one's ears, that's where spirituality happens. But either way, it seems like you've had a felt sense of something otherworldly.
Right.
Yes.
Well,
right.
I also say, Chet, that, I mean, at least for the historical stuff that I felt, if I didn't know about it, I wouldn't know it. I mean, it wouldn't, the fact that I knew what had happened in this spot at a certain time, I think adds to that feeling. I mean, I had that feeling in the Colosseum in Rome, like here you're 2,000 years ago, and this stuff, it is, but if I didn't know what that was, it's just like a bunch of ruins to me. I might not have it. So I agree with you. It kind of does occur between your ears, and certainly interpreting and seeing fantastic scenery, which to me is very moving. There are people look at a canyon, it's a hole in the ground. What can we mine uranium in it?
One other example of you come with your own preconceived notions to an experience is the fact that in the history of religious mysticism, the vast majority of religious mystics see a vision within their own tradition. It's very rare that you get a Jewish mystic who sees Muhammad or a Muslim mystic who sees Jesus, right? They might have a similar kind of psychoactive experience, but that experience becomes filtered through their religious mindset and training and education, so that they then interpret it as this image or that image. Alan, if you'd had a different dog come and lie in your bed, it would have been that would have been even more disturbing, right?
I would have yelled quite,
Right. It would have been a very different experience. So,
Or if it was a leopard.
Yeah. Now, could this be a similar experience to what Lori had? Obviously, I've traveled the world at times when I was in Dachau concentration camp, and going into the gas chambers or the crematorium, you get some type of feeling like, oh my God, how many people died in this gas in the gas chamber, or how many people were cremated, in the ovens.
Right, we think of spiritual as uplifting, but sometimes it can be that kind of negative association that still connects us to other people and experiences over time, over space. There are all ways of accessing this. I mean, I even think when I see one of the first paintings ever done in one of the cave painting collections was someone who took paint in a reed, a tube, put their hand on the wall, and just went and blew. And you see their handprint on the wall. Some have actually speculated it's a woman's handprint by the shape of the fingers, and this is beyond my knowledge to debate. But the very idea that somebody wanted to say, I was here, and put their hand on the wall, and I can see that hand, and I could compare you can't touch it now, but I could compare my hand to that hand. That's electric for me, and that's one of those transcendent experiences that doesn't require spirits to connect to. So for many people, in popular culture especially, if you go into the bookstore, remember bookstores where they sell books in physical locations? If you went into a bookstore and you went into the spirituality section of the bookstore, what would be the kind of things you would find? You would find auras and angels and the world soul and personal experiences of gods. And it would be a lot of this new age, supernaturally focused material. And it used to be the case that when people thought about that kind of supernatural spirituality, it was primarily or even exclusively channeled through traditional religion. You got it from going to church or going to synagogue. You got it from studying Torah or from venerating the saints or from a meditative practice. But it was always through the channels of the traditional religion, and it still is for some people, in fact for many people around the world. But there's also people who are kind of freelance spiritual, but still looking for something supernatural. And why is that the case? And why do we have a whole section in the bookstore called spirituality? If you went back to the Strand bookstore 100 years ago, my guess is they didn't have a section called spirituality. It wasn't something that had come up as a freelance kind of interest in human culture. So why doesn't traditional religion satisfy this spiritual need today for many people? Well, there's a new entity in the world. It's called the individual. Now, obviously we had individuals before, but in our last 100, 150 years or so, the rights of the individual, the dignity of the individual, the needs of the individual, and the personal eclectic choice of the individual has become much more important and much more liberated to be able to pursue those things. So before, if you were a Jewish person who wanted to study Buddhist meditation in the shtetl, that would have been unheard of. And today it's assumed in parts of California. So the mobility of people geographically to move and live in new places, their economic mobility to choose their own profession instead of being slotted into whatever their parents did, their ideological freedom to choose what they believe and to choose how they associate with others who share their beliefs, to choose whom they vote for. The very idea of voting dignifies the individual. But we also find in that society of mobility and freedom and choice, loneliness. Because for whatever the weaknesses of social life in the shtetl, you were never alone, like it or not. But in the modern world, you can be alone all the time. And you desire connection. You want some kind of deeper meaning, some kind of getting beyond your individual life, because your individual life, in your individual apartment, with your individual car, commuting alone, that's not enough. We need more. And the fact that we're flexible in terms of how you can identify and where you can pursue this kind of experience has opened this huge marketplace of spirituality. So you don't need to subscribe to the entire philosophical principles behind Hindu-style yoga. You can go for the exercise. And they do a little namaste at the beginning, but some people do it for the flexibility and for the strength and for the exercise. And they get a little bit of meditative time too. Maybe that works for them. But they can do it eclectically. They're not signing on to a discipline or converting to Hinduism to be able to have that experience. And same thing with Buddhist meditation or Native American style drumming circles or all kinds of other experiences that people feel are spiritual, but don't feel like it requires an identity or a religious tradition to define what's acceptable. And we'll also keep in mind that all the new discoveries of science and historical study and philosophy and world cultures has sort of broken down the rigidity of that religious tradition. I mean, we might have thought 1,000 years ago that Judaism had the monopoly on the universal truths of everything. And so why would you bother studying Islamic mysticism? They're just wrong. And Christian mystics have nothing to tell you because they're wrong. But now as we learn that they have coming-of-age ceremonies and they have a mystical tradition and they have a meditative practice, and we do too, well, oh, now we can explore how other people do this and we don't feel like we're betraying our own tradition to do that. So that's the supernatural style of spirituality, is, as Chet was saying, talking to the spirits, looking beyond oneself to a supernatural realm, either with one's own spirit or soul, or connecting with other spirits or souls. In some way, it's entirely beyond the natural world. Now, when we think of a natural spirituality, we're thinking of uplifting the human spirit. It responds to those needs of the new individual for connection and for getting beyond themselves and for uplift, but it's also responsive to new discoveries. So I want to share with you an example of a poem that I think does this very well. You've heard it before if you're part of Kol Hadash's ritual community, because we use it because I like it. That's how it works sometimes around here. So it's called In the Beginning by Primo Levi. Fellow humans, to whom a year is a long time, a century a venerable goal, struggling for your bread, tired, fretful, tricked, sick, lost, listen, and may it be mockery and consolation. 20 billion years before now, brilliant, soaring in space and time, there was a ball of flame, solitary, eternal, our common father and our executioner. It exploded, and every change began. Even now, the thin echo of this one reverse catastrophe resounds from the farthest reaches. From that one spasm, everything was born. The same abyss that enfolds and challenges us, the same time that spawns and defeats us. Everything anyone has ever thought, the eyes of every woman we have loved, sons by the thousands, and this hand that writes. This is taking those realities of science, and the individual for that matter, and turning it into inspiration to see how, even though time began and will destroy us in the end, it's beautiful, and everything happened to make us be able to write this poem. You even get the picture at the end of the poet with a pen sitting at a table writing the poem. It's a really wonderful expression of how you can use science for inspiration too. It's your connection to the entire universe, and it's not a question of disconnection and dispassionate analysis. This is beautiful. Check, you're going to ask me?
Yeah, I was thinking you have Keats up there as one of them.
Yeah.
He has, I just pulled it up, he has a thing that to me summarizes the essence of the spiritual experience. But you have to hear it, listen to it through the ears of a poet versus as an actual factual description of reality. To see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wildflower. Hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. So it's this subjective experience of infinity and of timelessness, even though when you're not in the middle of that experience, you can take a step back, look at it, and go, well, that's really just poetry. That's not real. But what a cool thing to be able to experience, as long as you don't get too carried away with it and start organizing your life around some of the beliefs that really are just poetic, not actually scientific.
Right, Alan.
Was that poem by Primo Levi written when he was in a concentration camp, or was it done
No, he
afterward?
wrote all his poetry afterward.
Afterward, okay.
He was really just a chemist before his concentration camp experiences, and I mean he might have done some writing, but nothing published as far as I know. But it was post-war that he began doing this real writing. He's got some beautiful stuff. One of the things I was going to say in response to what Chet was saying is that there's really three different ways we can approach these kind of phenomena. We don't have to be scientific all the time. We're not betraying science if we don't think analytically at every moment. So you can approach one of these meaningful experiences in a rational way. You can approach it in an anti-rational way, or you can be non-rational. So what do I mean by this? So a rational way would be analyzing it. You're listening to a jazz performance and you're counting the beats, and you're checking the key signature, and you're noting the fingering on the instruments. You know, you're analyzing the process of creating the music. Mm-hmm. You could also have an anti-rational approach which says there's no way we could ever possibly understand this, and you shouldn't even try to analyze it. And that's how people approach phenomena like auras and magic and things. They take an anti-analytical approach to it. They don't want anyone trying to measure it or define it. But there's a third option that's not rejecting rationality entirely and not purely rational. It's what I would call a non-rational experience. So I'm here at the jazz concert and I'm just going to listen. And I'm going to let the music flow over me, and I'll feel part of it. If I'm playing it, I'll just go with the flow. You know, I don't need to analyze it all the time to do this. Or another example, there's a wonderful book by Ron Aronson, who's a philosophy professor at Wayne State University in Detroit, called Living Without God. And he describes in a chapter on gratitude how he once took a hike out into the Michigan State Forest Preserve, and it was a hot day, and he was sweating, but he was also enjoying the exhilaration of it, and he came over a hill and looked down into a beautiful clearing with a beautiful lake there in the middle. And what began washing over him was a feeling of gratitude. And he's been an atheist most of his life. And so who is he grateful to? He said, I could map it out. I could say, well, I'm grateful to the taxpayers of Michigan that provided this park, and I'm grateful to the park rangers who cleared the path, and I'm grateful to the weather forecasters who gave me a good forecast. Like, you could map out that gratitude. But he said you don't need to do that. You can simply experience the feeling, and that's plenty. You don't need to rationally analyze everything all the time. It's not magic. You could map it out, but the moment itself is what's meaningful. So if you don't like the word spirituality, maybe you call it a peak experience. This is what Abraham Maslow, he has a book called The Varieties of Peak Experience. I think. Well, yeah, The Varieties of Peak Experience, which discusses this in more detail. Or maybe you call it a meaningful experience, or just an experience of meaning, where you have the experience and you say, wow, that was really important, even in retrospect. So some of the characteristics of these experiences of meaning or peak experiences, they're often a surprise. You didn't necessarily expect it. Sometimes you've cultivated it and you plan it, but sometimes it strikes you out of the blue. It often requires a kind of attentiveness or openness to experience it. If you're worried about your next text message, or you're checking your Facebook status all the time, it will get in the way of being open to those moments of special experience. It's also an out of the ordinary experience. I very rarely have these moments when I'm doing the dishes or folding the laundry. Those are the routine things that need to be done for life to continue. That's fine. My kids could fold the laundry, I guess, without me, but if I don't do it, it doesn't get done. So sometimes I do. I often do it. But the point is that these experiences of meaning are often beyond the ordinary experience, or something that you have to go out of your way to do. It doesn't just happen by itself. Fourth is, there's often this characteristic we've talked about before of a natural transcendence. You get beyond the self. You're not worrying about you for a change. Often these moments include silence. Sometimes music, but sometimes it's silence. Or when you think back on it, you just see things kind of in the suspended animation of that silent moment. I don't remember what was on the radio when I saw that rainbow. I don't remember the hustle and bustle of people around me when I was first touching that Western Wall. It's sort of a silent memory in some ways. And it can also be what they call a snapshot memory, a memory frozen in time. It's just incredibly vivid. And finally, you come out of these experiences feeling a spiritual or emotional uplift. You almost literally feel like you're higher, or you carry yourself higher, you're breathing a little bit higher, whatever that means. Now, we know these experiences are important because they meet basic human needs, right? They also break down the artificial barrier we have between our heart and our mind. We think of our emotions as one thing and our rational analysis as something else, but that's just not how the brain works. We know, again, rationally, analytically, it's all in our brain, right? It's all mind, it's not heart and mind. But really, it's our consciousness, and our unconsciousness it's all of us together that make the whole self, if there is such a thing. And we don't need to force ourselves to think in one category or the other and have one dominate the other. Having these experiences of meaning stop the rush of time and give us a chance to savor the moments. And they make us happy in a deep and lasting sense, and individual happiness is a worthy goal. So I want to share a second poem that talks about one of these special moments that saved in, one second, I just want to show this. Stop. Has preserved in words. Come on, there we go. It's called The Power of Accident. Actually, I can do this. Okay. Power of Accident by Lawrence Levine. Someone laid the petals in the big dictionary again. We always do that, placing such things in heavy books, wishing to hold what we know inevitably will pass. But have you noticed how perfectly they were located, pressed there between metalwork and meter, directly under metaphor? Surely that is what they are now. Their luminous bodies and lustrous flesh have gone where the summers go, and only the veins remain as testament to the sweet sap that ran with the solstice. But I will bet it was just chance that defined those petals so well. Chance can set things right. I mean, look at us, what we are, how we met in the deep waters between metalwork and meter, and then how we have come to cleave together, tighter than the weave woven of the shadows in the woods, thicker than the juices that run through all the golden veins of summer. So if you were writing this in prose, oh, I opened the dictionary and someone had left a flower petal right around the word metaphor in the dictionary. End of story. But that's not the moment. That's not his thought process, but also his emotional associations. And then he draws a broader lesson that maybe it was just luck. And I'm just fortunate to have found you and for us to have made a life together and to have had that survive the challenges of everything else. And we are even stronger than that power of nature. Now, this poet, Lawrence Levine, was actually a biology professor. But he used his knowledge of biology and plants, and it becomes this, this wonderful inspirational message about this moment in time that he remembered, and then he wrote a poem about it. And we find a lot of beautiful poems like that, that capture the moment and then expand it in a very meaningful way that we can feel what they were feeling. And that's really, one of the beauties of poetry and why we often use poetry for this kind of program, because it expresses emotions. And our spiritual experiences are about our emotions. It's not just a question of a rational analysis of a text that then gives us the mind of God. So there are a number of different ways that humanists can find these experiences of meaning. And we've talked about some of these, but I'm interested in talking about some other ones with you. We talked about natural experiences, when you have personal contact and experience through a mindful nature walk, or the smells or sounds or sights. It could be far away in an exotic location, like in Iceland or at the Grand Canyon. It could be in your own backyard. Sometimes we don't appreciate what's nearby and what's close. One of the things I've enjoyed, actually, about the last couple of years is how much more time people have been spending outside. And I've been able to spend outside. I never used to like eating outside before. Now I like it a lot. We had to at one time, but now I think I'm going to keep going. Also, there's that feeling connected to the natural world. It's the process of evolution. You see an early human ancestor. People love visiting the evolution displays at the natural history museums. The Natural History Museum in New York City, for example, is a beautiful display about human evolution, and you see the transitional forms and the skeletons, and it really does make you feel like you're having an out-of-body or out-of-individual mind experience. And then there's also participating in nature. People who plant and grow things. People who love the seasons. I remember I was talking to a member of the congregation who made a living as a dog walker. And she knew when the seasons were turning, because she's outside every single day. Or I was doing a funeral in March, and I was chatting with the funeral home director who was there, and he said, spring is on the way very soon. And I said, how do you know? And he said, I'm in the ground every day. He's digging the ground every day. He's seeing when it's starting to thaw, even down below where we can see. So that being part of nature, participating in nature, is one of those spiritual sources. A second example, a second sort of category of experience that we use is historical knowledge. You know, that temporal transcendence of archaeology, or the experience Lori had of being on a battlefield or going to an archaeological dig. But it could also be very personal, feeling your family roots. Some people study the language that their ancestors knew, or they go and visit the homeland. I know a lot of people who have gone back to where their families came from in Eastern Europe and maybe found the town, even found a headstone with their family name on, and it's very, very meaningful for them to have that sense of personal roots. That is a transcendent, uplifting experience for them. You know, that can be valuable for you. Some families are very much cemetery families, where they go to the cemetery regularly and they take etchings, and my wife's family goes back 4 or 5 generations in the Windsor, Ontario Jewish cemetery. Her great-great-grandparents are buried there, I think. So when they go over to Windsor, that's one of the stops, is they go to the cemetery and see the family. Other people, my family was not really a cemetery family. We didn't do that kind of thing. But for some people, that's a meaningful family roots kind of connection. Or using the menorah that your grandfather used. All those kind of heirloom pieces can be valuable and transcendent.
Maybe this is beyond the scope of our discussion today. I know there's not limited time, but how's having an experience of something there you could say, oh, that's pretty cool, versus something that you would say, that's transcendent. That's a spiritual experience.
Well, it depends on, it always depends on your definitions. So if your definition of spiritual a priori says it obliterates the self, then, or, you know, the sense of the self, then that kind of historical ancestral roots things might not do it. But if your sense of spirituality is getting beyond the individual life, getting beyond my time and my place, then archaeology, family heirlooms, then it does take you beyond that, and you could put it into your orbit of a spiritual experience. So it really just depends on how far you want to go. I think that, you know, maybe you do capital S and lowercase s, or, you know, spirituality level 1 and spirituality level 2. But I would think these kind of experiences are helping you feel part of something larger than yourself, getting beyond your own individual lifespan and experience. So I would class them in the broad category of spiritual. And again, it's going to be different strokes for different folks. Some people go through museums and have no interest in the archaeology section whatsoever. And they might love the contemporary art section, and they're going to be moved by different things. So what might be spiritual to one person, someone else might disagree and not find it to be what they would classify as spiritual. So I would have it by definition and also by sort of degree of intensity, maybe.
If I could just add one thing,
Please.
I think that, for me anyway, I think there's an emotional component to it. Very often in what I would call a spiritual moment, there's a feeling of, I don't know, in the pit of my stomach, maybe sometimes, you know, a shock of maybe a little adrenaline or something, the realization of something happening there that makes it, or just the immense beauty of something that you see, you know, the Rockies all with snow caps, and you just kind of go like, and it takes your breath away a little bit. So I think that rather the intellectual is separate from that somehow, that when I feel that spiritual thing, it's sort of like it takes your breath away a little bit, and you feel a jolt of emotion. That's just how I feel.
Sure. Now, I would argue that for some people, literature is an avenue to spiritual experience. Again, getting beyond your time and place, not thinking about yourself, getting caught up in the narrative, or the poetry, or, you know, literature in the broad sense of human creativity could be movies or theater too. But, you know, you think about stories that really resonate with you, where Jacob wrestles with God, and then he sees his brother Esau the next day and says, "Seeing your face is like seeing the face of God." It's sibling rivalry, it's projection, and it's grappling with the demons in your own soul. Or you have that wonderful line in Genesis where it says, "It's not good for humanity to be alone." That's just true. You know, whether or not Genesis is true, that line is true, because it's true for the human experience. There was a wonderful debate that two of our founding thinkers, Sherwin Wine and Yaakov Malkin, had at a colloquium, I believe it was in 1997, maybe 99, where Malkin was talking about the poetic truth of Genesis. And Sherwin said, "What do you mean poetic truth? The ethics are terrible." And Malkin's response was, "Who said poetic truth was good? Who said it fits your ethics? It rings true to the human experience." And so whether or not these stories actually happened, they often ring true to the human experience. They have that profound sense of pathos. You read the Binding of Isaac story, and there are no emotions presented explicitly. But as every time Isaac calls Abraham my father, Avi, and every time Abraham talks to his son, he says, Bani, my son. The repetition of Avi, Bani, my father, my son, my father, my son, it helps to raise the emotional tension because we know what's going to happen. But Isaac doesn't. And Abraham, maybe he's hoping for a reprieve, we don't know. But we just don't know, and it sort of builds the drama and the tension in the story, so you're almost crying at the end of it. But it's the drama that's built because of the human emotions behind it. And obviously poetry also can do this to us as well. I think about the very end of the book, The History of Love by Nicole Krauss, which is one of my favorite books. At the end just builds beautifully, and actually I almost like the audiobook better than the written book because they have the voices of the characters speaking and it goes back and forth between two characters in present and future. And it is just, listening to the end of that audiobook was one of the more meaningful literary experiences I've had in my life. And you've probably read books or seen movies or had moments like that where you just think, wow, like that does take your breath away. It does astound you in that moment. So literature might be one of those spiritual paths. For some people, ethics is a route to that inspiration. We sometimes talk about a deed being beautiful, right? It was a beautiful gesture. It was a beautiful deed. That's the language of aesthetics applied to ethics. But it has to do with, in both cases, our sense of this is something that is wholly beautiful, or that has something not just to be emulated in a practical sense, but something uplifting in seeing it happen. You know, you see that beautifully ethical gesture done, and you feel uplifted to have had the chance to see that. Or you do something yourself that feels like this was the right thing to do, and it's hard to do, but I did it, and you feel better about yourself. Some people are motivated by actions that give their lives meaning. Think about the famous line that Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel shared when he was marching with Martin Luther King in Selma. He said, "My feet were praying." There are people who don't mind it when there's social justice marches on Saturday because that's their Shabbat, is going out there and doing something. So that sense of helping other people, of being part of a cause that's greater than yourself, can often motivate people and help them be uplifted in that, what they consider a spiritual sense, that they're part of something, the movement that's greater than themselves. And I would argue, again, this depends on you, do you have to obliterate the self or not, that these personal connections we've talked about, when you have the wonder of love with another person, the power of children and parents. You know, I remember, I think my daughter was a few weeks old at the time, and I had a shocking realization that I could communicate with her. Because when she was crying, and I went in and picked her up, she stopped crying. She knew who I was. I had provided some comfort, and we communicated in some minimal, basic way. And that wonder of seeing your children behave as they do, having a second child and seeing how very different it is than the first child, even though it's the same genetic mishmash, you know, that comes out very differently. Having them, you know, have these milestones of walking and talking, and then you want them to stop moving so fast and quiet down, and, you know, it's the paradox of parenting. But it's that joy of transcendence also when you see them, and I've heard people talk about becoming grandparents and how it is an otherworldly experience for them to have grandchildren to relate to see what their children have produced, and the joy, the absolute joy you feel in that moment. I did read once, though, this is if you want to be the crassest operator ever, that when they are in the same age group, non-parents are actually happier than parents because they're getting more sleep, they have more disposable income, they can control their schedules, they can do whatever they want, right? But grandparents are happier than non-grandparents at that stage of life. So, you know, in theory, it's a long-term investment that pays off. Now, the survey also found that being a step-grandparent is no different emotional payoff-wise, happiness-wise, than being a biological grandparent. So if you really want to be crass about it, you don't have kids yourself, but then when you're older, you marry someone that had their own kids and thus produces grandkids for you, and you're the step-grandparent that the grandkids don't know any different. You've been there the whole time, and so you get the grandparent benefits at that stage, and you get the non-parent benefits. So if you really want to map out your maximizing your happiness profit on the way through life, you could do that. But we don't do that, right? Think about the passage of time and its defeat by human memory. I can picture my wife 20 years ago when we first got married. Not just from the picture on the wall, but I remember her. And I can remember my kids when they were younger. They don't look anything like that. And that little person is somewhere in there, maybe. But that's, again, getting beyond here and now and the way things are, and extend it to friends and community and the passage of time in that space too. We talked about beauty through music and art and so on. In the end, an experience of meaning is not something that I can define for you. It's defined by your experience. In the end, nature just is. It's neither beautiful nor ugly until we experience it, and then we, as Chet said, put it through our filter of our brains, and then it comes out with this positive experience. So I wanted to end the formal presentation, and then we'll have plenty of time to chat, with a short video clip from our Rabbi Emeritus Daniel Friedman talking about spirituality. Now, this was at a colloquium conference in 2001 called Secular Spirituality that our movement convened. There is a book version of it out there. There's also all the videos are on the Institute's YouTube channel. I can send you the link for that if you're curious to look at it. This was his presentation on art and nature and beauty as a kind of humanist spirituality. This is the very end of his presentation. So
absent the belief in a creator God, we may be more appreciative of a neighbor's garden because we are aware of the human intelligence and creativity, not to mention labor, that transformed randomly scattered seeds into an intelligently designed place of beauty. You know that old story about the visitor who is admiring his friend's garden and says, "You and God have done a wonderful job here." To which his friend replies, "You should have seen it when God had it to himself." Whatever we behold in the natural world of flowers, mountains, and oceans, and in the human world of buildings, poetry, and morality, we who locate spirituality entirely within the human mind may be all the more appreciative of that mind's power. We are all the less likely to dismiss it, to condemn it, to mistrust it, aware that beauty enriches our lives, evokes the most powerful emotions, and inspires the noblest possibilities within us. We naturally wish to cultivate beauty and the appreciation of beauty in ourselves, in our families, in our community. Returning now to the question with which we began, I shall this time answer it myself. Are you a spiritual person? Of course you are. Unless you have no use for music, literature, poetry, drama, or dance. Unless you are oblivious to the genius of Shakespeare and Chopin and the talent of Michael Jordan. Unless you are indifferent to the majesty of a mountain range or the spectacle of a starry sky. It is clear that your spirituality derives entirely from within you, and it is clear that it is you who imposes your values upon all of reality. That is your greatness.
So that's the human measure of meaning, right? We are the ones who experience it, and therefore we are the ones who create the spiritual experience. And it can come as very simply as waking up in the morning. There is one more moment of experience shared as a spiritual moment. This is Grateful by Bernard Green. Grateful I am as I awake each morning, drawing upward sleep breaking about my head as I fill my lungs with wakefulness. Grateful I am alive. Why this is so puzzles me, being in sound health and years away from the numbers of my death. Am I morbid of living, some Freud substitute? Is this the wages of secular sin obsessed? But I am silent and left only with gratitude, gifted now to each moment, and especially each flower. We can be grateful to be alive, to have moments, and to make meaning out of those moments.